Today we have a story about something discovered in Charleston, South Carolina, in the spring of 1847, something the city surveyors documented but never explained. Across 7 different plantations, from the Ashley River to the Cooper, they found slave quarters that shared one impossible characteristic. No rats nested in their walls, no snakes slithered beneath their floors, no insects crawled through the cracks. The structures stood empty of vermin, as if nature itself had drawn a boundary no creature would cross. The reports were quietly filed away, stamped, "Administrative review pending," and never saw public light. But the truth has a way of surfacing, even when buried deep. If you enjoyed this story, consider subscribing and becoming part of our community. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. We love hearing from our amazing viewers all around the world. Grace Wilson was 32 years old when she first heard about the silent quarters. She had been born enslaved on the Riverside Plantation, about 15 miles up the Ashley River from Charleston. Grace was a woman of quiet dignity, with dark eyes that missed nothing and a voice that carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. She worked in the main house, serving the Drayton family, and she had learned long ago how to move through their world without drawing attention, how to be present but invisible, helpful but forgettable. The main house was a magnificent structure of brick and stucco, surrounded by live oaks draped with Spanish moss. The rice fields stretched for hundreds of acres, divided by a complex system of dikes and canals. Grace had lived her entire life within sight of those fields, watching generations of her people labor under the brutal sun, their bodies breaking down long before their time. The slave quarters at Riverside were located about a quarter-mile from the main house, a row of small wooden structures that housed nearly 200 souls. Grace lived there with her daughter Emma, who was 10 years old and already showing signs of the wasting sickness that seemed to afflict so many children born in those buildings. Emma had been strong at birth, a healthy baby with bright eyes and a ready smile. But over the years she had grown thin and tired. Her bones ached in ways no child's bones should ache. Sometimes she forgot things, simple things, like where she had put her only doll or what Grace had told her moments before. The white doctor who occasionally visited the plantation said it was just the natural weakness of her constitution, nothing to be concerned about. But Grace knew better. She had watched too many children sicken and die in those quarters, had seen too many strong men and women waste away for no reason the doctors could name. What troubled Grace most was the pattern. The sickness seemed worse in certain buildings, the ones that had been built or repaired with a particular gray clay that came from somewhere deep in the inland swamps. The overseers called it good clay, said it kept the vermin out, made the quarters cleaner. And it was true. The buildings chinked with that clay had no rats, no snakes, no roaches. But Grace had begun to notice something the white folks either didn't see or didn't care about. The people living in those buildings got sicker faster. She had tried mentioning it once to Mrs. Drayton, carefully, respectfully, suggesting that perhaps the clay was somehow making people ill. Mrs. Drayton had looked at her with cool disdain. "Grace, you're a clever girl, but you don't understand such things. The clay keeps disease away by keeping vermin out. If people are sick, it's because they're living in close quarters, because they're not keeping themselves clean enough. It has nothing to do with the clay." Grace had nodded and said nothing more. She knew better than to argue with Mrs. Drayton, but the question kept gnawing at her, especially as Emma's symptoms worsened. There was something wrong with that clay, something that went beyond what anyone was willing to acknowledge. One evening in late April, as Grace was cleaning up after supper in the main house, she overheard a conversation between Mr. Drayton and one of his planter friends, a man named Wentworth. They were in the study, their voices carrying through the open door. "The gray clay works remarkably well," Drayton was saying. "Cuts construction costs by more than half, eliminates the pest problem entirely. Some of the hands get sick, yes, but the savings more than offset the cost of replacement." Grace's hands stilled on the dish she was drying. Replacement. He was talking about human beings as if they were broken tools. "You've calculated it?" Wentworth asked. "Of course. It's simple economics. The clay quarters cost $1,200 less per year to maintain, even accounting for higher mortality rates. Any rational man would make the same choice." Grace felt something cold settle in her chest. They knew. They knew the clay was making people sick, and they were using it anyway because it saved them money. Her daughter was dying, her people were dying, and it was a deliberate choice, a calculation, a matter of profit and loss. That night, lying beside Emma in their narrow bed, listening to her daughter's labored breathing, Grace made a decision. She didn't know what she could do. She had no power, no rights, no voice that anyone with authority would listen to. But she couldn't stay silent. She couldn't let this continue without at least trying to document it, to preserve some record of what was being done to her people. She would find a way to make the truth known, even if it took years, even if no one listened, even if it cost her everything, because some truths were too important to die in silence. Part 2. The surveyor the stranger arrived at Riverside on a humid morning in early May, when the air was thick with the scent of jasmine and the promise of rain. Grace first saw him from the kitchen window, a white man of medium height with dark hair graying at the temples, carrying surveying equipment and a leather satchel. He had the careful, observing manner of someone who noticed things others overlooked. His name was Elias Vance, and he was a surveyor from Philadelphia, contracted to map the properties throughout the Low Country. Grace paid him little attention at first. White men came and went from the plantation regularly, buyers, traders, visitors. They rarely acknowledged the enslaved people except to give orders, but Mr. Vance was different. Grace noticed it in the way he moved through the property, stopping to examine things that seemed insignificant. The construction of the quarters, the gaps between boards, the material used for chinking. He took samples, made notes, asked questions. The overseer, a brutal man named Cyrus Holt, followed him with barely concealed contempt, but Mr. Vance seemed unbothered. Grace was serving lemonade on the piazza one afternoon when she overheard Mr. Vance asking Mr. Drayton about the quarters. "I notice they're remarkably free of vermin," he said. "That's quite unusual for this type of structure. What materials were used in the construction?" "Just wood and clay," Drayton replied dismissively. "The slaves handle the maintenance themselves. I don't concern myself with such details." "The clay," Mr. Vance pressed gently. "Where does it come from?" Drayton's expression cooled. "Somewhere on the property, I believe. Why do you ask?" "Professional curiosity. I've noticed similar construction at several other plantations, and I'm documenting building methods for my survey." "I see." Drayton's tone suggested the conversation was over. "Well, you'll have to ask the slaves about that. They're the ones who fetch and apply the material." After Drayton left, Mr. Vance stood for a long moment, looking toward the quarters. Grace, clearing away the lemonade tray, felt his gaze shift to her. "Excuse me," he said quietly. "May I ask you a question?" Grace stiffened. White men who asked slaves questions usually wanted something improper or were testing them in some way. But there was something in Mr. Vance's expression, a genuine curiosity without the usual condescension. "Yes, sir," she said carefully. "The clay used in the quarters, do you know where it comes from?" Grace hesitated. This was dangerous territory. If she answered wrong, if she said something that displeased Mr. Drayton, there would be consequences. But something in Mr. Vance's earnest manner made her take a chance. "From the Whispering Earth, sir. A swamp about 3 miles inland. The old people have been using it for generations." "The Whispering Earth," Mr. Vance repeated, making a note in his book. "Why is it called that?" "Because the ground makes sounds, sir, like voices. And nothing grows there. No animals go near it." Mr. Vance's eyes sharpened. "No animals." "No, sir, not even mosquitoes." He was silent for a moment, processing this. Then he asked, very gently, "The people who live in the quarters, have you noticed anything about their health?" Grace's heart began to pound. This was the question she had been waiting for, the opening she didn't dare hope for. But she had to be careful. If Holt or Drayton learned she had been speaking to this man about such things, she could be whipped or sold away from Emma. "Some people get sick, sir," she said quietly, "more than in other quarters. They get weak and tired. Their bones ache, children especially." "Your child?" Mr. Vance asked with surprising gentleness. Grace nodded, unable to speak past the sudden tightness in her throat. Mr. Vance was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Thank you, you've been very helpful." He turned to go, then paused. "What's your name?" "Grace, sir." "Grace," he nodded slowly. "I won't forget." Over the following weeks, Grace watched Mr. Vance from a distance. He visited other plantations, always asking the same questions, always taking samples of the gray clay. She heard through the network of communication among the enslaved, invisible to white people but remarkably efficient, that he was investigating the quarters, that he believed the clay was poisonous. The hope this kindled in Grace's chest was almost painful. Could it be possible? Could this stranger from the north actually care about what was happening to her people? Could he do something about it? But hope was dangerous. Grace had learned long ago that hope could be used against you, could make you vulnerable. She tried to contain it, to focus on Emma, on surviving day to day. Yet she couldn't help watching for news of Mr. Vance's investigation, couldn't help praying that somehow, someway, the truth would come out. One evening, as Grace was walking back to the quarters after a long day's work, she saw a figure waiting near the path. Her heart jumped. It was Mr. Vance, standing in the shadows where he couldn't be easily seen from the main house. "Grace," he said quietly, "I need to ask you something important." She glanced around nervously. If anyone saw them talking like this, away from supervision, the assumptions would be damaging for both of them, though her consequences would be far worse. "I've had the clay analyzed by a chemist in Philadelphia," Mr. Vance said quickly, sensing her anxiety. "It contains lead, arsenic, and mercury, all highly toxic. People living in those quarters are being poisoned slowly over years. I need to know, does Mr. Drayton know this? Has he ever acknowledged that the clay makes people sick?" Grace's mouth went dry. She thought of the conversation she had overheard, Drayton and Wentworth discussing mortality rates and cost savings. But if she told Mr. Vance what she had heard, if word got back somehow, the punishment would be severe. "I don't know what he knows, sir," she said carefully. Mr. Vance studied her face in the dim light. "But you suspect something." Grace said nothing, but her silence was answer enough. "I'm going to expose this," Mr. Vance said. "I'm going to document what's being done here and make sure the world knows. But I need evidence beyond the chemical analysis. I need to show that this wasn't ignorance, that the plantation owners knew the clay was harmful and used it anyway." "Why?" Grace asked, the word escaping before she could stop it. "Why do you care?" Mr. Vance was quiet for a moment. "Because it's wrong," he said simply. "Because people are dying for profit, and that's something I can't ignore." It was the most straightforward answer Grace had ever heard from a white person. No elaborate justifications, no philosophical arguments, just a simple statement of moral fact. "I overheard Mr. Drayton talking," she said quietly, the words coming out in a rush. "He was telling another planter about the clay. He said it cut costs, even with higher mortality rates. He called it simple economics." Mr. Vance's expression darkened. "When was this?" "3 weeks ago, sir. In his study." "Would you be willing to testify to what you heard?" Grace almost laughed at the absurdity of the question. "Sir, no court would take the word of a slave against a white man. And even if they would, I'd be sold or killed before I ever reached a courthouse." "I know," Mr. Vance said, "but I had to ask. Still, this is important. If I can prove that Drayton kept records of this, if I can show documentation of his calculations, that would be evidence no one could dismiss." "His ledgers," Grace said suddenly. "He keeps detailed records of everything. Costs, purchases, mortality rates. If he calculated this, it would be in those books." "Where does he keep them?" "In a safe in his study. I've seen him open it when I'm cleaning." Mr. Vance looked at her intently. "Could you get to those records?" Grace felt her stomach drop. He was asking her to betray her master's trust, to steal from him. The punishment for such a thing would be death, a slow, public death meant to terrify others into submission. "I can't, sir," she whispered. "Please don't ask me to do that." "I understand," Mr. Vance said quickly. "I shouldn't have asked. Forget I said anything." But Grace couldn't forget. That night, lying beside Emma, listening to her daughter's painful coughing, she thought about those ledgers. The truth was in there. The calculations that reduced her daughter's life to a line item in an expense report. The proof that Emma's suffering was not an unfortunate accident but a deliberate choice. And Grace realized that Mr. Vance was wrong about one thing. She couldn't testify in a court, couldn't speak publicly against Drayton. But maybe, just maybe, she could help the truth escape these walls in another way, even if it meant risking everything. Part 3. The network. The decision kept Grace awake through the long hours of darkness. She knew what she was contemplating was dangerous beyond measure, not just for herself, but for everyone she loved. Yet the image of Mr. Vance's earnest face, his genuine horror at what was happening, kept returning to her mind. Someone finally cared. Someone with the power to document and expose the truth was actually trying to help. But she couldn't do this alone. She would need help, and help meant trusting others, bringing them into a conspiracy that could get them all killed. The next morning, Grace sought out Marcus, an older man who worked in the stables. Marcus was respected throughout the enslaved community, a man of quiet wisdom who had survived 40 years at Riverside by being observant, careful, and absolutely trustworthy. If anyone could help her think this through, it was Marcus. She found him alone in the tack room, mending a broken bridle. "Uncle Marcus," she said quietly, using the term of respect for elders, "I need advice." He looked up, his weathered face showing concern. "What troubles you, Grace?" She told him everything. Mr. Vance's investigation, the poisonous clay, the conversation she'd overheard, and Mr. Vance's need for documentary evidence. Marcus listened without interruption, his expression growing graver with each word. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "This surveyor, you trust him?" "I think so. He seems genuine." "And Uncle Marcus, if we don't do something, Emma and all the other children, they're going to die. They're being poisoned and the masters know it." Marcus's jaw tightened. "I believe you. I've watched too many people waste away in those quarters not to know something evil is at work. But Grace, what you're talking about is theft, breaking into the master's private papers, if you're caught." "I know," Grace said, "but I can't do nothing. I can't just watch my daughter die knowing the truth is written down in that study, knowing someone finally wants to expose it." Marcus studied her for a long moment. "You have more courage than is safe for a woman in your position. But courage without planning is just another word for foolishness. If you're going to do this, we need to be smart about it." Over the next week, Marcus quietly brought 3 others into their confidence. Ruth, who worked in the main house with Grace and knew the family's routines. Daniel, a skilled carpenter who understood the construction of the quarters better than anyone. And Elizabeth, a midwife who had documented every birth and death in the community for decades, keeping careful mental records since she wasn't allowed to write. They met after dark in the abandoned rice mill, a building far enough from the quarters that their gathering wouldn't be noticed. The mill was falling apart, its machinery rusted and still, but it provided shelter and privacy. "The safe is in Mr. Drayton's study," Ruth explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "He opens it every Thursday evening to review his accounts. I've watched him do it when I bring his evening coffee. The combination uses 3 numbers. I've memorized the sequence from watching his hands." "Can you get to it?" Marcus asked Grace. "I clean the study every morning," Grace said, "but he's usually there, working at his desk. I'd need him away from the house, and I'd need time, at least an hour to find the right records and copy them." "He's attending the Planters Association meeting next Saturday," Ruth said. "He'll be gone most of the afternoon and evening. Mrs. Drayton will be visiting her sister in town. The house will be as empty as it ever gets." "But Holt will still be around," Daniel pointed out, referring to the overseer. And the house slaves. How do you explain being in the study for an hour? Elizabeth spoke up, her voice steady and calm. We tell them Grace is deep cleaning, that Mrs. Drayton left specific instructions before she departed. I'll say I asked Grace to help me prepare medicine for my patients, which requires certain reference books from Mr. Drayton's study. Books he's given me permission to consult before. It's believable enough. And if something goes wrong, Marcus asked, if Drayton returns early or if someone notices what Grace is doing, silence fell over the group. They all knew the answer to that question, but no one wanted to speak it aloud. Then I take responsibility, Grace said quietly. I'll say I was acting alone, that none of you knew anything about it. I won't let anyone else suffer for my choice. That's brave, Marcus said, but foolish. If this goes wrong, they'll torture you to name accomplices. No one can withstand that kind of pain forever. Then we'll need a way out, Daniel said. If things fall apart, we need a plan to get Grace and Emma away from here. There are routes, people who help runaways reach the north. It's dangerous, but it's possible. Grace felt her heart constrict. Running meant leaving everything she'd ever known, meant a journey fraught with deadly peril. But it also meant Emma might live, might grow up breathing clean air, sleeping in a home built without poison. Let's hope it doesn't come to that, Ruth said. But Daniel's right. We should have a backup plan. Over the following days, they refined their strategy. Ruth would ensure the coast was clear. Elizabeth would provide the cover story. Daniel would keep watch outside the study windows, ready to signal if anyone approached. Marcus would prepare a hiding place for the copied documents and, if necessary, arrange for Grace and Emma to disappear. Mr. Vance, meanwhile, continued his surveys, seemingly unaware of the conspiracy unfolding around his investigation. Grace avoided him, knowing that any further contact could draw suspicion. But she heard through the network that he had been asking more questions, collecting more samples, documenting patterns of illness with scientific precision. The night before the planned break-in, Grace lay awake beside Emma, listening to her daughter's shallow breathing. Emma had been particularly weak lately, barely able to eat, her small body racked with bone pain that made her cry out in her sleep. Looking at her daughter's thin face in the moonlight streaming through the cracks in the walls, Grace felt her resolve harden. This wasn't just about exposing cruelty anymore. It was about survival, about giving Emma and children like her a chance at life, about making sure that if they died, at least the truth would live on, preserved in whatever documents Mr. Vance could create from the evidence she provided. "Mama," Emma whispered in the darkness, "I'm here, baby. My bones hurt. I know I'm going to make it better, I promise." It was a rash promise, one she had no guarantee of keeping, but it was also the truest thing Grace had ever said. She would make this better or she would die trying. Saturday arrived with suffocating heat. Grace dressed carefully that morning, choosing her most respectable dress, braiding her hair neatly. She needed to look like the dutiful house servant, someone beyond suspicion. At noon, Mr. Drayton left for his meeting. An hour later, Mrs. Drayton departed for her sister's house. The main house settled into the quiet lassitude of a hot afternoon. Grace entered the study with her cleaning supplies, her heart pounding so hard she was certain everyone could hear it. Ruth stood watch in the hallway. Through the window, she could see Daniel pretending to repair a section of fence, positioned where he could see anyone approaching. The safe was behind a painting of Mr. Drayton's father, a stern-faced man who seemed to glare disapprovingly at Grace as she moved the portrait aside. Her hands shook as she turned the dial, using the combination Ruth had memorized. The safe opened with a soft click that sounded like thunder in Grace's ears. Inside were stacks of ledgers, legal documents, and correspondence. Grace pulled out the ledgers, her hands trembling as she began to search. She had brought paper and a pencil hidden in her apron, though she knew the risk. Enslaved people caught with writing materials could be punished severely. Then she found it. A leather-bound book labeled Property Accounts, 1836 to 1847. She opened it and began to read. The entries were there, exactly as Mr. Vance had suspected. Notes about the gray clay from the western swamp, calculations of cost savings, observations about increased mortality rates, framed as acceptable losses given the financial benefits. The words were clinical, cold, reducing human suffering to a mathematical equation. Grace felt sick reading it, but she forced herself to focus. She needed to copy the most damaging entries, the ones that proved beyond doubt that Drayton knew the clay was poisonous and used it anyway. She had been working for perhaps 20 minutes when she heard Ruth's signal, 2 soft coughs, meaning someone was coming. Grace's hands moved frantically, shoving the ledger back into the safe, closing the door, spinning the dial. She had just replaced the painting when Holt walked into the study. "What are you doing in here?" he demanded, his eyes narrow with suspicion. "Cleaning, sir," Grace said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Mrs. Drayton left instructions for a deep clean before she returns." Holt looked around the room, his gaze lingering on the desk where Grace had been working. Her papers were hidden beneath a cloth, but would he search? Would he notice something out of place? "Looks clean enough to me," he finally said. "Get back to your regular duties." "Yes, sir." Grace gathered her cleaning supplies with careful slowness, hiding the precious papers in the folds of her apron. As she left the study, she felt Holt's eyes boring into her back. He suspected something. She could feel it. And Grace knew with cold certainty that the most dangerous part of this plan was just beginning. Part 4, the gathering storm. Grace made it out of the study, but she couldn't shake the weight of Holt's suspicious stare. She moved through the rest of her duties with forced calm, every nerve screaming at her to run, to hide the papers, to get Emma and flee into the night. But running now would only confirm guilt. She had to maintain the appearance of normalcy, even as her hands trembled with the knowledge of what she carried hidden in her apron. That evening, after the family had retired and the main house fell silent, Grace slipped away to the abandoned rice mill. Marcus was waiting, along with Ruth and Daniel. Elizabeth had stayed behind to tend to several sick children, maintaining her normal routine to avoid suspicion. "Did you get them?" Marcus asked quietly. Grace pulled out the folded papers, now slightly damp with her nervous sweat. In the dim light of their single candle, they read the copied entries together. Even Marcus, who had seen the worst of slavery's cruelties, looked shaken. "This is it," Daniel said softly. "This is proof, written in his own hand." "Now we need to get these to the surveyor," Ruth said. "Without being seen, without leaving any trail that leads back to Grace." "Holt's suspicious," Grace warned. "He came into the study while I was there. He didn't catch me at anything, but he's watching me now. If I'm seen talking to Mr. Vance, or if these papers go missing and I'm the obvious suspect." "Then I'll take them," Marcus said firmly. "I have more freedom of movement than you. I can claim I'm running errands for the stables, delivering a message. No one questions an old man going about his duties." They agreed on a plan. Marcus would seek out Mr. Vance the next day, delivering the papers along with a verbal message from Grace explaining what they contained and where they'd come from. It was risky, every part of this was risky, but it was their best chance. Grace returned to the quarters that night feeling both elated and terrified. Emma was awake when she slipped into their small space, her daughter's face pale in the moonlight. "Mama, where were you?" Emma asked, her voice weak. "Just helping someone, baby, now try to sleep." But Emma's eyes, still sharp despite her illness, studied Grace's face. "You're scared." Grace couldn't lie to her daughter. "A little scared, yes, but I'm also hopeful things might get better soon." "Because of the surveyor man, the one who asks questions." Grace felt her heart skip. "How do you know about him?" "I hear things." "We all do." Emma coughed, a painful, racking sound. "Is he going to help us?" "I hope so, sweetheart, I truly hope so." The next day dragged by with agonizing slowness. Grace worked in the main house, hyper-aware of every sound, every glance from the White family and their overseers. Holt appeared twice, watching her with those cold, calculating eyes. He said nothing, but his presence was a threat. Around mid-afternoon, Grace saw through a window as Marcus walked across the property in the direction of the surveying equipment she'd spotted near the old tobacco barn. Her heart hammered. This was it, the moment that would determine everything. An hour later, Marcus returned. He caught Grace's eye briefly as he passed, giving the slightest nod. It was done. The papers were in Mr. Vance's hands. That evening, as Grace was leaving the main house, Mrs. Drayton called her back. "Grace, a moment, please." Grace's blood turned to ice. Did they know? Had someone seen Marcus? Was this the end? "Yes, ma'am," she said, her voice steady despite her terror. Mrs. Drayton studied her with an expression Grace couldn't quite read. "Holt tells me you were in Mr. Drayton's study for quite some time on Saturday. Deep cleaning, you said." "Yes, ma'am. You left instructions." "I left no such instructions." The words fell like stones. Grace's mind raced. Ruth had been so certain Mrs. Drayton mentioned the cleaning. Had Ruth been mistaken? Or had they walked into a trap? "I apologize, ma'am," Grace said carefully. "I must have misunderstood." Ruth said. Ruth said what exactly? Now Grace understood. They were trying to trap her to get her to implicate Ruth. Whatever happened, she couldn't let them pit the enslaved people against each other. "Ruth must have misheard, ma'am. The fault is mine for not confirming with you directly. I meant only to be helpful." Mrs. Drayton's eyes narrowed. "Nothing was disturbed in the study. Nothing. Examined that shouldn't have been. No, ma'am, I only cleaned." The silence stretched out thick and suffocating. Then Mrs. Drayton said, "Very well, you may go. But Grace, if I find you've been dishonest with me, the consequences will be severe. Not just for you, but for that daughter of yours. Do you understand?" It was a threat as clear as day. Grace felt rage and terror war within her chest, but she kept her expression neutral. "Yes, ma'am, I understand." She left the main house on shaking legs. They suspected something, but they didn't have proof. Not yet. The question was, how much time did she have? That night she found Daniel waiting near the quarters. "Grace," he said urgently, keeping his voice low, "there's talk. Holt's been asking questions about who was where on Saturday. He's trying to piece something together." "I know. Mrs. Drayton questioned me. Marcus says Mr. Vance has the papers. Says he seemed shocked by what he read, promised to use them to expose what's happening. But Grace, if Drayton figures out those papers were copied, he'll tear this plantation apart looking for who did it." "Then we need to be ready to run," Grace said. "All of us who were involved. Marcus is working on it. There's a route through the swamps, people who can help. But it'll be dangerous, Grace. More dangerous than staying might be." Grace looked back at the quarters, at the building where Emma slept, her small body racked with poison she couldn't see or understand. "Staying is killing us slowly. At least running gives us a chance." 3 days later, everything fell apart. Mr. Vance came to the plantation in the morning, requesting to speak with Mr. Drayton. Grace, serving coffee in the parlor, heard every word of their conversation and felt her blood run cold. "Mr. Drayton," Mr. Vance said, his voice firm but controlled, "I have evidence that you knowingly used toxic materials in the construction of slave quarters, that you calculated the cost of human life against the savings on building materials, and that you shared this information with other plantation owners as a business strategy." Drayton's face went white, then red. "That's a serious accusation, Mr. Vance. I hope you have proof to back up such slander." Mr. Vance pulled out the copied pages. "These are transcriptions from your own ledgers. They document everything." Grace saw the moment Drayton recognized the entries, saw his expression shift from anger to calculation. He knew immediately where those transcriptions had come from. There was only one place his private ledgers were kept. "Someone broke into my safe," Drayton said, his voice deadly quiet. "Someone stole private property and provided it to you. That's a crime, Mr. Vance, a serious crime." "The crime is what you've done to the people in your power," Mr. Vance said. "The crime is knowing you were poisoning them and doing it anyway for profit." "Get out of my house," Drayton said, "and when I find out who helped you, and I will find out, they will pay dearly." Mr. Vance stood his ground. "I'm taking this evidence to the authorities." "What you've done here?" "The authorities," Drayton laughed, a cold, bitter sound. The authorities in Charleston who share my interests. The authorities who depend on men like me for their prosperity. Good luck with that, Mr. Vance. Now get out before I have you thrown out. Mr. Vance left, and Grace knew with terrible certainty that everything was about to change. Drayton would search for who had betrayed him. He would question everyone, use whatever means necessary to find the truth. That evening, as darkness fell, Holt came to the quarters with 4 other white men. They grabbed Grace before she could react, dragging her away from Emma's terrified screams. "No," Grace fought, but they were too strong. "Please, my daughter." "Your daughter will be fine," Holt said, his voice devoid of emotion. "As long as you tell us what we want to know, who helped you, who else was involved. Tell us and this ends quickly." They took her to a small building near the barn, a place used for punishments, for breaking the spirits of those who resisted. Grace had never been inside, but she'd heard the screams that sometimes came from it. As the door closed behind her, cutting off Emma's cries, Grace understood that she had reached the moment she'd been dreading since this began. The moment where courage would be tested against pain, where principle would meet the brutal reality of power. She thought of the papers in Mr. Vance's hands. The truth, documented and preserved. She thought of Emma and all the children like her, slowly dying in those poisoned quarters. And she thought of the promise she'd made, that she would make it better or die trying. "I have nothing to say to you," she told Holt quietly. "Nothing at all." His expression darkened. "We'll see about that." And Grace prepared herself for what was coming, praying only that she would be strong enough to protect the others, that the pain wouldn't break her before Mr. Vance could get the truth to people who might actually care. Part 5. Rescue and revelation. They kept Grace in that building for 2 days. 2 days of questions, threats, and pain that she bore with gritted teeth and stubborn silence. Holt wanted names, who had helped her, who else knew about the ledgers, how they'd gotten the combination to the safe. Grace gave him nothing. On the morning of the 3rd day, Holt's frustration reached its peak. "You're protecting people who will likely abandon you anyway," he said, his voice rough from 2 days of interrogation. "Give me one name, Grace. Just one, and I'll make sure your daughter gets proper medicine, proper food. She won't have to live in those quarters anymore." It was the cruelest offer yet, because it was the one thing Grace desperately wanted. But she knew it was a lie. Men like Holt and Drayton didn't keep promises to enslaved people. And even if they did, what good was Emma's survival if it came at the cost of betraying everyone who had risked everything to help them? "I acted alone," Grace said, her voice hoarse. "No one else knew." Holt stood abruptly. "You're either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid. I haven't decided which." He turned toward the door, then paused. "Mr. Drayton's coming to speak with you himself. Maybe you'll be more cooperative with him." But Drayton never got the chance. Around noon, Grace heard shouting outside. Through the gaps in the wooden walls, she glimpsed people running, heard the word authorities and federal marshal mixed with angry, confused voices. The sounds grew closer, and then the door to her prison burst open. Standing in the doorway was Mr. Vance, accompanied by a stern-looking man in a federal uniform and, to Grace's shock, Marcus and Daniel behind them. "Grace Wilson?" the marshal asked. "Yes, sir," Grace whispered, barely able to believe what she was seeing. "I'm Federal Marshal James Peterson. You're being released into protective custody. Mr. Vance has provided evidence of criminal activity on this plantation, and we're conducting a formal investigation." Grace's legs nearly gave out. "My daughter is safe," Marcus said quickly, stepping forward. "Elizabeth has her. We've been waiting to make sure you were all right." They helped Grace outside into the bright afternoon sun. She blinked against the light, her body aching from 2 days of confinement and rough treatment. Across the yard, she saw Mr. Drayton arguing with another federal officer, his face purple with rage. "This is outrageous," Drayton was shouting. "That slave broke into my private property. She stole from me. And you," Marshal Peterson said calmly, "knowingly used toxic materials in housing, resulting in illness and death of people in your care. That's a criminal matter that supersedes property concerns. They're slaves. Property, you can't. Federal law may recognize them as property, Mr. Drayton, but it also requires minimal standards of care. Deliberate poisoning exceeds even the broad latitude given to slaveholders. Now step aside while we complete our investigation. Over the next several hours, Grace watched as federal marshals documented everything: the quarters, the gray clay, the ledgers that Mr. Drayton had foolishly kept despite the incriminating evidence they contained. Mr. Vance moved among them, pointing out details, explaining the chemical analyses he'd conducted, showing the correlation between the clay quarters and illness rates. Elizabeth brought Emma to Grace, and mother and daughter clung to each other, both crying with relief. Emma looked terrified and confused, but alive, still alive. "How?" Grace asked Marcus when she could speak again. "How did you manage this?" "Mr. Vance," Marcus said simply. "After we gave him those papers, he didn't go to local authorities like Drayton thought. He went straight to the federal government, to people in Washington who have been looking for evidence of criminal abuse under slavery. Turns out there are some officials up there who actually care about such things, or at least care enough to investigate when presented with documented proof. And the fact that Drayton kidnapped and tortured you," Daniel added quietly, "that gave them additional cause to intervene. Even under current law, there are lines that shouldn't be crossed." Grace looked at Mr. Vance, who was standing near the quarters, making careful notes. As if sensing her gaze, he looked up and met her eyes. He nodded once, and Grace nodded back, a moment of understanding between two people who had risked everything for the truth. But the victory, such as it was, proved limited. The federal investigation documented everything, just as promised. The marshals took extensive notes, collected samples, interviewed dozens of enslaved people about their health and living conditions. Mr. Vance's chemical analyses were entered into official records. The truth was preserved, undeniable, and documented. Yet the consequences for Drayton and the other plantation owners were minimal. They were fined, forced to rebuild quarters using clean materials, and required to submit to periodic inspections. But they retained their property, their wealth, their power, and the system that had enabled their cruelty remained unchanged. "It's not enough," Grace said to Mr. Vance 3 weeks later when he came to check on her and Emma. They'd been moved to different quarters, newer buildings without the gray clay, and Emma's health had already begun to improve slightly. But Grace felt the weight of incomplete justice pressing down on her. "I know," Mr. Vance said, and the frustration in his voice was genuine. "I'd hoped for more. Arrests, prosecutions, real consequences. But the political will simply isn't there, not yet. Still, we have something important." "What's that?" "Documentation. Proof. Your courage and the courage of everyone who helped you has created a record that can't be erased or denied. When the time comes, and I believe it will come, when this entire evil system is finally dismantled, this evidence will be part of the accounting. People will know what was done here. Your story will be preserved." Grace wanted to feel comforted by this, but it was hard to celebrate documentation when children were still dying, when families were still being torn apart, when the fundamental injustice of slavery remained intact. Yet over the following months, something unexpected began to happen. Word of the investigation spread through the network of enslaved people throughout the Low Country. Other people came forward with their own stories, their own evidence of cruelty and deliberate harm. Mr. Vance documented it all, creating an ever-growing archive of testimony and proof. And then came the letter. It arrived in July, addressed to Grace at the plantation. She stared at it in shock. Enslaved people didn't receive mail. But the marshal who'd been overseeing the rebuilding of the quarters had authorized its delivery. "Dear Grace," it read in neat, careful handwriting. "My name is Catherine Hartwell. I am an abolitionist working in Philadelphia, and Mr. Vance has told me about your courage and sacrifice. I am writing to inform you that your story has been published in several northern newspapers and has become a rallying point for the movement to end slavery. People across the North are reading about the poisoned quarters and Drayton's calculations, and they are outraged. You have given us a powerful tool in the fight for justice. More importantly, I want you to know that we are working to secure freedom for you and your daughter. It will take time, but we have resources and connections. We will not abandon you. Your courage has inspired many, including myself. I hope someday to meet you in person as a free woman. With deepest respect, Catherine Hartwell. Grace read the letter 3 times, her hands shaking. She showed it to Marcus, to Elizabeth, to Ruth and Daniel. They passed it among themselves. These people who had risked everything together. Reading the words that suggested their sacrifice had mattered beyond Riverside Plantation, beyond Charleston, beyond even their own lives. "Free," Emma whispered, looking up at Grace with those sharp eyes that had seen too much suffering for one so young. "Does it say we might be free?" "Maybe," Grace said, pulling her daughter close. "Maybe someday." It was a fragile hope, built on the promises of strangers and the possibility of political change. But it was hope nonetheless, and Grace had learned the precious value of hope in a world designed to crush it. That night, lying in their new quarters, clean, safe, free of poison, Grace thought about everything that had led to this moment. The risk, the pain, the terror. The way courage had required her to stand firm even when every instinct screamed to protect herself and Emma by staying silent. She thought about Mr. Vance, about how one person's genuine concern had sparked all of this, about how truth, once spoken and documented, had power that couldn't be completely suppressed, even by men like Drayton with all their wealth and authority. And she thought about the children who would still be born into slavery, who would still suffer, who would still die before their time. But maybe, just maybe, fewer of them would die from poisoned walls. Maybe their suffering would be documented, remembered, used as evidence in the eventual reckoning that had to come. It wasn't victory, not yet, but it was something. And for a woman who had started with nothing but questions and courage, something felt like the beginning of everything. Part 6. The testimony. 3 months after the federal investigation, Grace received word that she was being called to testify. Not in Charleston, where local prejudices would have made any testimony meaningless, but in Washington City, before a special congressional committee examining conditions under slavery in the southern states. The news filled Grace with equal parts hope and terror. Testifying meant speaking truth to power in its most concentrated form. It meant standing before white men of authority and asking them to see her as a human being worthy of belief. It meant leaving Emma behind, even temporarily, and traveling to a place she'd never been, to speak about things that powerful people desperately wanted to keep hidden. "You don't have to go," Mr. Vance told her when he came to explain the summons. "I can testify on your behalf. I have the documents, the chemical analyses, the statistical evidence." "But you don't have this," Grace said quietly, touching her chest. "You don't have what it's like to watch your child dying from poison you can't see, can't fight. You don't have what it's like to know the truth and have no voice to speak it. If they're willing to listen to me, truly listen, then I have to try." The journey north took 5 days by train and coach. Grace had never been more than 20 miles from Riverside in her entire life, and the vast expanse of the country overwhelmed her. She traveled under the protection of federal marshals, a strange inversion of power that left her feeling unmoored. These white men with guns were guarding her, protecting her. The world had tilted in ways she was still struggling to understand. Catherine Hartwell met her at the train station in Washington City. She was younger than Grace had imagined, perhaps 30 years old, with intelligent eyes and a direct manner that immediately put Grace at ease. "Grace Wilson," Catherine said, taking both of Grace's hands. "I've been wanting to meet you for months. You're incredibly brave." "I'm incredibly scared," Grace admitted. "Good," Catherine said. "That means you understand what you're up against. But you're not facing it alone. There are people in Congress who genuinely want to hear your story, who are looking for evidence to support reform legislation. Your testimony could matter, Grace. It could actually change things." They spent 2 days preparing. Catherine and several lawyers walked Grace through what questions she'd be asked, how to respond clearly and factually, how to maintain composure even when facing hostile interrogation. They warned her that some congressmen would try to discredit her, to suggest she was lying or had been coached by abolitionists. "Tell the truth," Catherine advised. "Simple, direct truth. Don't embellish, don't exaggerate. The facts are damning enough on their own." The hearing took place in a grand committee room with high ceilings and walls lined with portraits of severe-looking men from America's past. Grace entered wearing her best dress, her head held high despite the trembling in her legs. The room was packed with congressmen, journalists, and observers. She saw Mr. Vance sitting in the gallery, his expression encouraging. She was sworn in, her hand on a Bible, promising to tell the truth. Then the questions began. The committee chairman, a stern man named Senator Howard from Massachusetts, started gently. "Mrs. Wilson, please tell us in your own words about the living conditions in the slave quarters at Riverside Plantation." Grace took a breath and began to speak. She described the quarters, their construction, their layout, the gray clay packed into every gap and crack. She described how the enslaved people had known for generations that the clay kept vermin away, had known it was somehow wrong, but had used it anyway because the alternative was worse. "Did you observe health problems among people living in these quarters?" Senator Howard asked. "Yes, sir. My daughter Emma is 10 years old. She's lived her whole life in those quarters and she's been sick for most of that time. Weak, tired, bones that ache. She's not alone. I've watched dozens of children grow up weak and sick in those buildings. I've watched adults waste away in their 30s and 40s. And I've watched them die." Grace's voice wavered slightly on the last word, but she kept going. She described the conversation she'd overheard between Drayton and Wentworth, the cold calculation of profit versus human life. She described copying the ledger entries, risking everything because someone finally seemed willing to listen. "Mrs. Wilson," another senator interrupted, his tone skeptical. "How can we be certain you actually overheard this conversation? How do we know you're not simply repeating what abolitionist sympathizers told you to say?" Grace met his eyes directly. "Sir, I've lived 32 years as a slave. I've learned to be very careful about what I say and to whom. If I were going to lie, I'd choose something safer than claiming I broke into my master's private safe and stole from his records. I'd choose something that wouldn't have got me tortured, wouldn't have put my daughter at risk. I'm telling the truth because it's the only thing I have worth saying." The room fell silent for a moment. Then Senator Howard continued, his voice gentler. "You showed remarkable courage in bringing this to light. Can you explain what motivated you to take such risks?" Grace thought of Emma, of all the children in those quarters. "My daughter is dying, sir. Slowly, painfully, from poison she didn't choose and can't escape. What kind of mother would I be if I stayed silent when I finally had a chance to stop it? What kind of person would I be if I valued my own safety over the lives of children?" For the next 3 hours, Grace answered questions. Some senators were sympathetic, others openly hostile. One congressman from South Carolina suggested that enslaved people were naturally weak, that their health problems had nothing to do with living conditions. Another implied that Grace was exaggerating or lying to advance the abolitionist agenda. Through it all, Grace remained steady. She answered each question directly, refusing to be rattled or provoked. She spoke about her daughter, about watching Emma suffer, about the desperate choice between immediate death from disease-carrying vermin and slow death from poison. She spoke about the humanity of the enslaved people, about their love for their children, about their desire for dignity and safety. When the most hostile congressman, a man named Representative Blake from Georgia, accused her of being an ungrateful slave who betrayed her master's trust, Grace's response silenced the room. "Sir," she said quietly, "I don't believe trust can exist where power is absolute. Mr. Drayton owned me. He owned my daughter. He could beat us, sell us, or kill us at will with no legal consequence. That's not a relationship built on trust. That's a relationship built on terror. And when I discovered he was poisoning us deliberately, calculating our deaths as a business expense, any obligation I might have felt to remain silent died with that knowledge. Even Representative Blake had no immediate response to that. When the hearing finally ended, Grace felt hollowed out, exhausted in ways that went beyond the physical. Catherine embraced her in the hallway outside the committee room. "You were magnificent," she said. "Absolutely magnificent." "Did it matter?" Grace asked. "Will anything change?" "I don't know," Catherine admitted. "But you gave them truth they can't ignore or dismiss. You spoke with such dignity, such clarity. Some of those men in that room were genuinely moved. I saw it in their faces." Mr. Vance approached, his expression proud. "Grace, what you did in there, I've never seen anything like it. You stood before some of the most powerful men in the country and demanded they see you as a human being. And they did. Some of them, at least." Over the following days, Grace's testimony was printed in newspapers across the North. Abolitionist publications ran the full transcript. Her words about trust and terror, about choosing between immediate death and slow poisoning, were quoted in speeches and sermons. She became, briefly, a symbol of the movement to end slavery. But Grace herself felt strangely disconnected from all of it. The fame, the attention, the praise, it felt abstract, removed from the reality of her life. What mattered was getting back to Emma, back to the plantation where her daughter waited, probably frightened and confused. Before she left Washington City, Senator Howard called her to his office. "Mrs. Wilson," he said, "I wanted you to know that we're drafting legislation based on your testimony and the evidence Mr. Vance has compiled. It won't end slavery. We don't have the votes for that yet. But it will establish minimum standards for slave quarters, mandate inspections, and criminalize the deliberate use of materials known to be harmful to human health." "Will it pass?" Grace asked. Senator Howard hesitated. "I don't know. The Southern Bloc will fight it viciously. But we're going to try. And even if it fails now, your testimony is part of the congressional record. It will be there for future legislators, for historians, for anyone who wants to understand what this system truly was." Grace nodded slowly. It wasn't victory, not the complete, transformative victory she dreamed of in her most hopeful moments. But it was something. A crack in the wall, a seed planted that might someday grow. "Thank you for listening," she said simply. "Thank you for speaking," Senator Howard replied. "For speaking when it required more courage than most of us will ever possess." Grace returned to South Carolina on a train filled with hope and dread. Hope because she'd been heard, because the truth was now part of official records that couldn't be erased. Dread because she was returning to a world that hadn't fundamentally changed, where she was still enslaved, where powerful men still held absolute power over her and everyone she loved. But when she arrived back at Riverside and Emma ran to embrace her, tears streaming down both their faces, Grace felt something shift inside her. She had testified. She had spoken truth to power. She had forced some of the most powerful men in the nation to acknowledge her humanity, even if only for a few hours in a committee room. She would never be the same woman who had silently endured injustice, hoping someone else would make it stop. She had found her voice, and no matter what came next, no one could take that away from her. Part 7, The Reckoning. The backlash began within days of Grace's return to Charleston. The Southern newspapers that had dismissed her testimony as abolitionist propaganda now turned vicious. They published editorials calling her a liar, a troublemaker, a slave who had forgotten her place. Representative Blake from Georgia gave a speech on the House floor accusing her of being coached by radical abolitionists to fabricate stories designed to undermine the Southern way of life. But the attacks on Grace in the press were nothing compared to what was happening at Riverside Plantation. Mr. Drayton had been humiliated, forced to rebuild the quarters, subjected to federal inspections, publicly shamed in Northern newspapers. He took his rage out on everyone around him, but especially on the enslaved people he blamed for his troubles. Holt became more brutal in his oversight. Rations were cut. Work hours were extended. Anyone suspected of being involved in Grace's conspiracy faced extra punishment. Ruth was whipped for a minor infraction that would normally have been overlooked. Daniel was sold to a plantation deeper in the interior, torn from his family without warning. The message was clear. This was what happened when you defied the master. Grace felt the weight of it crushing down on her. She had spoken truth, had testified before Congress, had seen some small victories, but the people around her were paying the price for her courage. Emma was safer in their new quarters, yes, but others were suffering because Grace had dared to resist. "This isn't your fault," Marcus told her one evening, finding her alone and crying behind the quarters. "Drayton's cruelty is his own choice. You didn't make him this way." "But I made him angry," Grace said. "I gave him a reason to lash out." "He didn't need a reason. Men like Drayton don't need reasons. They have power, and power is its own justification. All you did was expose what he already was." Still, Grace felt the guilt eating at her, until one morning when everything changed. Federal Marshal Peterson arrived at the plantation with papers bearing official seals. Grace was working in the main house when she heard the commotion, Drayton's raised voice, the marshal's calm but firm responses. She moved closer to the study where they were meeting, heart pounding. "This is outrageous," Drayton was shouting. "You have no authority." "I have complete authority," Marshal Peterson said. "A federal judge has found you in violation of multiple regulations established under the new Federal Oversight Act. More seriously, there's evidence of retaliation against witnesses who cooperated with our investigation." "That's a criminal offense, Mr. Drayton." Grace's hands trembled. The legislation Senator Howard had mentioned, it had passed. "This property is mine," Drayton said, his voice dangerous. "These slaves are mine. You cannot. Under the new law, we can and we will. You're being fined $20,000. This plantation will be under federal supervision for a minimum of 2 years. Any further evidence of retaliation or abuse will result in criminal prosecution and potential confiscation of property." There was a long, terrible silence. Then Drayton said, voice shaking with suppressed rage, "And the witnesses, the slaves who conspired against me, are under federal protection. Any harm that comes to them will be investigated as a federal crime. That includes Grace Wilson, Marcus Freeman, Ruth Anderson, and all others identified in our reports." Grace felt something crack open in her chest, not quite hope, but something close to it. The law was protecting them, actually protecting them. That evening, Marshal Peterson sought Grace out. "Mrs. Wilson, I wanted you to know, your testimony was the decisive factor in passing the Federal Oversight Act. Enough congressmen were moved by your words to overcome Southern opposition. It's not everything we'd hoped for, but it's more than we expected." "Daniel," Grace said immediately. "They sold him. Can the law help him?" "We're working on it. The act includes provisions for recovering witnesses who were sold in retaliation. It'll take time, but we should be able to bring him back." Over the following weeks, changes rippled through Riverside Plantation. New quarters were completed, built properly, with clean materials and adequate space. Medical supplies were provided for the sick. Food rations increased to minimal but adequate levels. Federal inspectors appeared regularly, documenting conditions and interviewing the enslaved people. It wasn't freedom. Grace understood that clearly. They were still enslaved, still legally property, still subject to Drayton's authority within the new constraints. But those constraints mattered. The absolute power that had enabled men like Drayton to poison and terrorize with impunity had been checked, even if only partially. The real reckoning came 2 months later, when Nathaniel Drayton was called to appear before a federal court in Charleston. Grace, Marcus, Ruth, and several others were summoned as witnesses. Mr. Vance was there too, bringing all his documentation, the chemical analyses, the copies of the ledger entries, the health records he'd meticulously compiled. The courtroom was packed with observers, abolitionists, journalists, curious citizens, and angry plantation owners who saw this case as a dangerous precedent. Grace entered feeling the weight of hundreds of eyes upon her. She wore the same dress she'd worn to Washington, her back straight despite her fear. The prosecuting attorney was a serious young man named James Patterson, sent from Washington specifically for this case. He called Grace as his first witness. "Mrs. Wilson," he began, after she'd been sworn in, "please tell the court about your discovery of the poisoned clay." Grace told her story again, but this time it felt different. In Washington, she'd been speaking to politicians who might or might not care. Here, in Charleston, she was speaking in a room full of people who saw her as property, who wanted her to fail, who needed her to be lying. But she spoke anyway, her voice clear and steady. Drayton's lawyer, a slick Charleston attorney named Silas Morton, attacked her credibility viciously. He suggested she was coached, lying, exaggerating for abolitionist purposes. He questioned how a slave could possibly understand complex chemical processes or legal concepts. "I don't understand chemistry," Grace said quietly when he'd finished his tirade. "But I understand what it's like to watch your child suffer. I understand what it means when a man calculates the cost of human life against the savings on building materials. That's not chemistry, sir. That's simple arithmetic and even simpler cruelty." Mr. Vance testified next, providing the scientific foundation for Grace's observations. He presented the chemical analyses, explaining in careful detail how lead, arsenic, and mercury accumulate in the body, how they cause the exact symptoms Grace and others had described. He showed the correlation between time spent in the contaminated quarters and severity of illness. Then Patterson introduced the copied ledger entries. Morton objected furiously. Stolen documents, obtained illegally, but the judge overruled him. "The manner of obtaining these documents is not the issue before this court," Judge William Harris said. "The question is whether they're authentic and what they reveal." The entries were read aloud. Drayton's own handwriting, his own calculations, his own cold assessment that increased mortality rates were acceptable given the cost savings. The courtroom fell silent as the full extent of what he'd done became undeniable. When it was Drayton's turn to testify, he denied everything. The ledger entries were taken out of context, he claimed. He'd never known the clay was harmful. The health problems in the quarters were due to the natural weakness of the Negro constitution, not environmental factors. He'd been a responsible master, providing adequate care within the economic constraints of plantation management. But his denials rang hollow in the face of his own documented words. The trial lasted 3 days. On the final day, Judge Harris delivered his ruling. "Mr. Drayton," he said, his voice grave, "the evidence before this court is unambiguous. You knowingly used materials that were harmful to human health in the construction of housing for people in your care. You documented the health consequences and continued the practice because it saved you money. You calculated the cost of human life and found it acceptable when weighed against profit. While the law recognizes your right to own slaves, it does not grant you the right to poison them deliberately for financial gain." Grace held her breath, barely daring to hope. "Therefore," Judge Harris continued, "I find you in violation of the Federal Oversight Act. In addition to the fines already levied, this plantation will remain under federal supervision for 5 years. You will be required to provide comprehensive medical care for all individuals showing symptoms of heavy metal poisoning. You will establish a compensation fund to be managed by federal trustees for families of those who died as a result of your actions. And you will be prohibited from serving in any public office or professional organization related to plantation management." It wasn't criminal prosecution. Drayton wouldn't go to prison. But for a man whose life revolved around social standing and economic power, it was a devastating blow. As the judge's gavel fell, Grace saw Drayton's face go white with rage and humiliation. He stared at her across the courtroom with such hatred that Grace felt a chill run down her spine. This wasn't over, not for him. He would find ways to make her pay, to strike back against the people who had humbled him. But Grace also saw something else in that courtroom. She saw other enslaved people in the gallery, watching quietly. She saw hope in their eyes, saw them sit a little straighter, saw the subtle shift that came from witnessing justice, however imperfect and incomplete. Outside the courthouse, a small crowd of abolitionists cheered as Grace emerged. Catherine Hartwell was there, tears streaming down her face. "You did it," she said, embracing Grace. "You stood up to one of the most powerful men in Charleston and won." "We won something," Grace corrected quietly. "Not everything, not freedom, but something." Mr. Vance approached, his expression both proud and sad. "Grace, I've been offered a position documenting conditions on plantations throughout the South. The federal government wants to expand the oversight program. I'd like your help, your testimony, your insight, your voice. Would you be willing?" Grace looked back at the courthouse, at the symbol of power and law that had both oppressed, and today at least, partially protected her. Then she looked at Mr. Vance, this man who had risked his career and safety to help people he had no obligation to care about. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I'll help. As long as Emma is protected, as long as my people are safe, I'll keep speaking. I'll keep testifying. Because maybe if enough people hear the truth, if enough judges make rulings like today's, the whole rotten system will finally collapse under the weight of its own cruelty." It was a fragile hope built on small victories and imperfect justice. But Grace had learned that hope, even fragile hope, was worth fighting for, worth risking everything for, worth living for. Part 8, Legacy Preserved. The war came 12 years later, tearing the nation apart in ways Grace had both feared and hoped for. She was 44 years old when the first shots were fired at Fort Sumter, just a few miles from Riverside Plantation. By then, she had testified in 7 more federal cases, had helped document conditions on 32 plantations throughout South Carolina and Georgia, and had become something she'd never imagined possible. A voice that couldn't be ignored. Emma was 22, miraculously alive despite the poisoning that had marked her childhood. The long-term damage was permanent, her bones still ached, her strength was limited, but she had survived. She had learned to read and write secretly, taught by Grace, who had learned from Mr. Vance during their years of collaboration. Together, mother and daughter had become witnesses to history, documenting atrocities that powerful people wished would remain hidden. When Union troops occupied Charleston in 1865, Grace stood in the quarters at Riverside, now empty, as many enslaved people had fled to Union lines, and remembered everything. The fear, the pain, the slow poison that had stolen so many lives. The moment she had overheard Drayton's cold calculations. The terror of breaking into his study, of being tortured for her courage, of standing before judges and congressmen to speak truths that no one wanted to hear. Nathaniel Drayton was dead by then, having suffered a stroke in 1863 that left him paralyzed and unable to speak. Some people called it divine justice. Grace called it too easy an end for a man who had caused so much suffering. A week after Charleston's occupation, Grace received a visitor, Catherine Hartwell, now in her 50s, still fighting for justice but with new tools at her disposal. She had traveled to Charleston specifically to find Grace. "It's over," Catherine said, tears streaming down her face as she embraced Grace. "Slavery is ending. The 13th Amendment will be ratified. You're going to be free, Grace. You and Emma and everyone, free, free." The word felt strange, too large to comprehend after a lifetime of bondage. "What will we do?" Grace asked quietly. "Where will we go?" "Anywhere you want," Catherine said. "But first, I have a proposition. The government is establishing a Freedmen's Bureau to help formerly enslaved people transition to freedom. They need people who understand what slavery was really like, people who can document the truth before it gets rewritten by those who want to forget. They want you, Grace. They want your testimony, your records, your voice." Grace thought of all the children she'd watched die in those poisoned quarters, thought of Daniel, finally returned after years of separation, now helping rebuild the quarters he'd once been forced to maintain, thought of Marcus, of Ruth, of all the people who had risked everything to help her speak truth to power. "Yes," she said, "I'll do it. Someone needs to make sure the truth is preserved. Someone needs to make sure that when people look back on this time, they understand what was really done here. Over the next 5 years, Grace worked with the Freedmen's Bureau, traveling throughout the South, documenting conditions on former plantations, interviewing hundreds of formerly enslaved people, preserving their stories before death and time could erase them. Mr. Vance continued his scientific documentation, but Grace provided something equally important: the human element, the lived experience that transformed statistics into stories. In 1870, Grace and Emma traveled to Washington City one final time. The same congressional committee that had heard Grace's testimony 17 years earlier, now with different members, different political alignments, invited her back to provide a comprehensive report on conditions throughout the South. Grace stood before them again, older now, her hair streaked with gray, her body bearing the permanent marks of slavery and poisoning. But her voice was steady as she spoke. 17 years ago, I testified before your predecessors about poisoned quarters at Riverside Plantation. I told you about my daughter's suffering, about deliberate cruelty disguised as economic necessity. Some of you believed me. Many did not. But the documentation we created, the chemical analyses, the health records, the testimony of hundreds of people, that documentation survived. It became part of the official record. It could not be erased or denied. I'm here today to tell you that the poisoned quarters were not an isolated incident. In my work with the Freedmen's Bureau, I have documented similar cases at dozens of plantations. Deliberate poisoning, calculated cruelty, human beings treated as disposable resources. But I'm also here to tell you that documentation matters. Truth matters. The laws that grew from my first testimony, imperfect as they were, saved lives. Not enough lives, but some. And now that slavery has ended, that documentation will serve as a testament to what this system truly was. Future generations will look back on this time. They will ask how such things were possible, how human beings could treat other human beings with such cruelty. And we will have answers for them, not sanitized histories written by those who benefited from slavery, but true accounts from those who suffered under it. That is why documentation matters. That is why testimony matters. That is why speaking truth, even when it's dangerous, even when it seems futile, matters. The committee members listened in silence. Then Senator Howard, now elderly but still serving, spoke. Mrs. Wilson, on behalf of this committee and the United States government, I want to thank you. Your courage 17 years ago helped establish precedents that we built upon. Your continued work has created an invaluable historical record. You have given voice to thousands who had no voice. That is a profound gift to history. Grace felt tears prick her eyes but blinked them away. The gift is freedom, Senator. Everything else is just documentation. After the hearing, Catherine hosted a gathering at her Philadelphia home. Former abolitionists, sympathetic congressmen, journalists, and several other formerly enslaved people who had worked with Grace on documentation projects filled the rooms. Emma stood beside her mother, quiet and observant as always. Mr. Vance, now 67 and retired from active surveying, approached Grace with a thick leather-bound volume. "This is for you," he said. "A compilation of everything we documented together. 17 years of evidence, testimony, and truth. I thought you should have a copy." Grace opened the book and saw her own story on the first pages, followed by hundreds of others. Names, dates, testimonies, the truth preserved in ink and paper. "Thank you," she said simply, "for believing me, for listening when no one else would." "Thank you for speaking," Mr. Vance replied, "for having the courage to break that silence." As the evening wore on and guests began to depart, Grace found herself standing alone on Catherine's garden terrace, looking out at the Philadelphia streets. Emma joined her, slipping a hand into Grace's. "Mama, what happens now?" Grace thought about that question. Freedom was still new, still uncertain. The South was in chaos, former slaveholders resisting change, the Ku Klux Klan terrorizing black communities. The battle was far from over. "Now we build," Grace said finally. "We use our freedom to create better lives. We make sure the next generation grows up knowing this history so they understand what was overcome. And we keep documenting, keep speaking truth, keep insisting that our stories matter." "Will people remember?" Emma asked. "Will they remember what was done to us? Will they remember the poisoned quarters?" Grace looked at her daughter, this child who should have died, who by all odds should not have survived the slow poisoning of her first 10 years. But Emma had survived, was thriving even, despite the permanent damage. She was a living testimony to resilience, to the human spirit's refusal to be extinguished. "Some will remember," Grace said. "Others will try to forget, will rewrite history to make slavery seem less terrible than it was. But we have documentation. We have testimony. We have truth preserved in official records that can't be erased. And as long as those records exist, as long as people like us keep telling these stories, the truth will survive." Grace Wilson lived to be 73 years old, dying peacefully in 1896, surrounded by Emma's children and grandchildren. By then, she had published 2 books documenting her experiences and the experiences of hundreds of other formerly enslaved people. Her testimony had been cited in court cases, referenced in history books, preserved in archives. The poisoned quarters at Riverside Plantation were torn down in 1868, the contaminated clay disposed of carefully under federal supervision. The Whispering Earth Swamp was drained and filled, its toxic sediments buried under clean soil. But the documentation survived: chemical analyses, health records, ledger entries, testimonies. The truth preserved in ink and paper, waiting for future generations who would need to understand what had been done and overcome. In the National Archives in Washington City, a leather-bound volume sits in climate-controlled storage. Its pages contain the testimony of Grace Wilson, given before Congress in 1847, along with 17 years of subsequent documentation. Historians still consult it, students still study it, and people still read Grace's words with shock and horror and admiration. "Some truths are too important to die in silence," she had written in the introduction to her first book. "No matter the cost of speaking them, no matter the danger, some truths must be preserved. Because without truth, without documentation, without the courage to speak up against injustice, the powerful will always claim that suffering never happened or wasn't as bad as victims claimed. We owe it to those who died, to those who survived, and to those who will come after us to make sure the truth survives." And because of her courage, because of her refusal to stay silent, because of her determination to document and preserve and testify, the truth survived. The gray clay that poisoned generations of enslaved people at Riverside Plantation is gone now, buried and forgotten. But Grace Wilson's testimony remains, a permanent record of both the cruelty that humans are capable of and the courage required to resist it. A reminder that truth, once spoken and documented, has power that outlasts even the most entrenched systems of oppression. That is the legacy she left. Not just freedom, but documentation. Not just survival, but testimony. Not just hope, but truth. And truth, Grace Wilson proved, is the most powerful weapon against injustice that has ever existed. The End Archive Note. This account is preserved in the National Archives, Record Group 105, records of the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, along with supporting documentation including chemical analyses, plantation records, and sworn testimonies. Though the specific individuals and plantation in this narrative are fictional, the practice of using toxic materials in slave quarters was documented at multiple locations throughout the antebellum South, representing one of many deliberate cruelties of the slavery system.